Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. We're going to continue our series on Viewport PBR lighting. The goal of this series is not to necessarily develop shaders and materials that are, I suppose, truly authentic, physically based rendering, such that you could see in the viewport exactly what you're going to see when you go to render internally. That's typically what Viewport PBR refers to. Rather, I'm working on a series here that's going to show you how to apply more physically based appearing materials and textures in the viewport for the purpose of rendering from the viewport. That is to render final renders from the viewport very, very quickly. I have a scene here set up, and you can see that I have a couple of basic materials applied with some ambient light applied using a couple of techniques that we're going to go into. And this is all viewport shading, and I can click on the OpenGL button, and then in a second I have a full HD resolution image complete with shadow and all other kinds of interesting little details. So what we're going to concern ourselves with today in this tutorial, in this one portion of material we're going to look at, is the application of shadow. If you saw my previous tutorial, it's this one here. If you saw my previous tutorial, that's the 2.78 Viewport PBR lighting tutorial, I discussed the creation of box maps and how to generate those box maps that can be used for environment mapping for reflection and diffuse textures in the viewport from equirectangular images. So that's what the purpose of that first tutorial in the series was. I very briefly demonstrated how you could apply a diffuse box map texture on top of an existing material to sort of generate the effect of ambient scene lighting. And that was a very general kind of application. We're going to get a lot deeper because that first application would not permit you to use lights in the scene. So we have to find a way not only to use a light in the scene that reflects the light source in our equirectangular environment, but also one that doesn't violate or require a lot of nuancing to change the lighting that is coming from the diffuse texture. That is, we want the diffuse texture to supply most, if not all, of the color needs for the environment lighting, and then our source light just to function as I guess a shadow mask or a shadow matte. So that's the goal here. It's going to be fairly simple. This series is going to go kind of one type of material at a time, and the idea is as we do this, we're going to generate node groups that you can save, and then they'll be you'll be able to just kind of plug and play those node groups later as you're developing simple materials later on down the road. So again, when you make these node groups, you should save them, keep them in a file separate so that you can import them, load them in, or load up a template, and then use your node groups to generate materials for PBR viewport rendering very, very quickly. So that's the goal here. We're also going to use a very simple kind of strategies in order to accomplish these materials, but I want to take a moment to show you some more complex projects that are out there. This one here is, I did reference this before, but a question was asked on my last tutorial about the possibility of doing PBR viewport rendering in cycles, and I did cover this in a kind of a review earlier, several months ago. This is a PBR branch that's being created by this individual here, Clement Foucault. I'm not sure exactly how you say his name, but this is his build of Blender. It's on version 0.4. It's kind of been sitting in this state for a while, but it's a very robust instance of the idea, and you can download it here from his website, Clement Foucault.com, and then follow the links here. And it's multi-platform, so you can download it for just about any platform that you might be using. I'm using Linux. I want to mention, however, that this requires a fairly robust graphics card that can handle the OpenGL gaming requests that the build requires in order to function. So this Viewport study here is able to generate what's called probe mapping. That is, it can actually do approximated reflections on objects within the scene to each other, which is really great. So we can't do that right now in the internal Viewport application that we're going to look now. We're really stuck with just using world maps. But this instance can do that, and it uses the node setups and cycles, which are very logical, make a whole lot of sense. So I would invite you to look at that if your machine can handle it. It doesn't have to be very powerful, but the graphics card needs to be relatively newer. So if you have a 4 or 5 year old machine, you may have a little bit of trouble using this build. Another one I will show you is this one. This is a CG Masters tutorial. It's on YouTube. And they're covering exactly the same things that I'm looking at on my series. However, they're using a little bit more of a complex math-based node setup in the creation of their materials. So we're going to do a little bit more of an artistic we're going to go more of an artistic route. So we're going to use our eye to kind of sort out what kinds of things work and what kind of things don't. Whereas this tutorial series is very complex, very complicated, but very productive and very fruitful labor here. They put together a really interesting kind of tutorial, and I think they might even have a few blend files. So I would invite you to check that out too. Very, very good instance. And by the way, they are using game textures, which would be the box textures that we generated in the last tutorial. So if you downloaded some equirectangular environments and created some box maps, you could use this very, very quickly, and you could jump right in and apply your maps to this tutorial very, very easily. So those are things I wanted to show you. Also wanted to show you that I have a few other materials here. I downloaded a couple of additional materials from our last one. You'll remember that we had kind of this construction site that we were using, and we generated this box map reflection and this diffuse texture. From that, I also have a couple of others we're going to use. This is kind of an atrium. This is from the Wikimedia Commons again, and I generated this box map reflection, low res, and this diffuse texture using the same process as we discussed in the last tutorial. And I also have this one here, which is a kind of a museum. It looks like a science museum, again from the Wikimedia Commons. And this is the reflection box map, and this is the diffuse box map, again using that same process. So I created these three instances because I want to show you the plug and play ability of what we're going to do. That once you generate these node setups, you can just change your environments, and it should approximate very well very quickly. So let's get into it. We'll take a look here what's going on. I have here our original scene that we were looking at, and I'll turn off the ambient occlusion here real quick. We have our original scene, and you can see our equirectangular environment of the construction site, and there is this kind of a platform plate here I have to make the picture, and then we have two instances of Suzanne, and you can see that what we're getting is let me select Suzanne here and move around. You can see that we're getting shadows, that we're generating shadows, one Suzanne to the next, and also onto this plane here that we have. And that's, if we turn on the ambient occlusion, the screen space ambient occlusion, we get pretty close to kind of a final render looking image here where we have environment lighting affecting the textures and the material here, plus the application of shadow. So we're going to look at how to do this one thing and generate a node group from that. But very quickly before I do that, I just want to show you the portability of it. If I go to my lights over here, I have one light for this construction site, and it's set kind of out there in space. If I turn off the only render, it's set out here in space, so it's shining in the general direction of the sun to cast the shadows. If I kill that light, and you can see the ambient lighting going on in here, how that works out pretty well, the node setup that we're going to create. If I turn on, see these two lights, these are for another scene, and I go to the World tab and the texture, and we'll switch out this to another image. We'll go to this atrium image. So this is the scene set up here. Let me turn off the plane so you can see real quickly. Now I have the environment, but you can see, and I have the lights. There is two lights that I placed in this scene that are kind of projecting the light coming from these windows up here, and then the windows on the opposing side. And then the diffuse map takes care of all the other lighting in the scene as far as we're concerned with ambient lighting. But this will generate shadows as well using these lights, so we can get the basic essence of shadows from the main lighting in the scene. But you can see that the reflection, or rather the diffuse texture that's being applied here, is from the construction site. So I have to switch those two. If I go to a Suzanne and go to the material setup, you see I have a few different materials in here that I'm drawing from in my node setup. One of them is reflection. If I go to the reflection tab and go to the texture tab, and under that reflection, I'm going to change it to the atrium reflection box map. And then I'm also going to go to, of course that's not being applied here, we're just using the diffuse one. I'll go to the diffuse material and I'll click on the texture slot, and under diffuse, this would be updated in all my node groups. I will go to my atrium diffuse texture there, and you can see the lighting instantly matches now the true environment. Not only is that applied to the Suzannes here, but the plane that I have there is also using those same textures in order to derive its lighting. And if I turn on only render, you can see this looks like these objects are fairly true to the space there with respect to the lighting and the shadows. And just one more real quick one. We'll go to the world slot again just to prove the concept one more time. I'll turn off my atrium lights that I set in there. And the other place was this museum. I've got 3 lights in there, much lighter. And we'll go to the world tab, go to the texture slot for the world tab, and we'll go to the museum folder here, load up our equirectangular projection. So this is our museum. And we have our lights on. Now I just need to change our diffuse lighting here. So we'll go to the one of these Suzannes, and actually just to prove it, I'll go to the plane actually, and then we go to the material slot. Actually, we can't see it in there, so we'll have to go to the Suzanne where we have that material loaded in. We'll go to the diffuse material, select the texture, and I'll load up the museum diffuse box map, and everything changes. So now we have our Suzannes. They appear to be in the environment that they're actually in, with the lighting that they should be getting in there. And we'll get rid of this plane so you can kind of see what that looks like. So you see this is world lighting being applied from materials and textures rather than lights. The light is just a mask so that we can get shadows. Let's see how this is put together. We'll save this real quick, and we'll load a new instance. So again, we are in Blender 2.78. You need to be using that latest version, otherwise none of these features will be available to you. A few things of housekeeping here we have to do at the beginning. We want to enable GLSL shading, and we'll set this to texture or material. It doesn't really matter. We'll leave our lamp in there for the time being. We'll get rid of our default cube. and we will add a Suzanne, because Suzanne is very useful for demonstrating lots of things. We will go through this drill again. We'll add a modifier, subdivision surface, bump it up to 2, set it to smooth, and we're ready to rock and roll. So we have a light in this scene. We're going to use the light, but we're not going to use it right away. We're going to generate a couple of shadeless materials first. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll select Suzanne, go to the material slot, and we're going to add a new material. This new material is going to be all white, although we probably won't really use the coloring. It's going to be shadeless. We're going to call this material composite. We're going to use this actually to composite a number of other materials together. You can map textures in the Blender internal node setup. You can. It is a pain in the neck. It's not nearly as easy and logical as it is in the cycles node setup. So the way I look at it is that if you have this material dialog over here that automatically takes care of a whole bunch of features for you, there's no real sense in going through the node process until you really need to. So what we're going to do is we're going to generate some whole materials over here, and then we're just going to use those whole materials inside of the node editor later on, and it's just going to save us a whole lot of trouble. Now if I was in cycles I wouldn't do that, but because we're in the Blender internal, it's just a whole lot easier to do that. I've done things like that before in previous tutorials, so if you've seen those others you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a couple of materials, additional ones. We'll add another one underneath here, and we're not going to map this to anything. We're just going to make the material so it's available to us. I'm going to hit New, and we're going to call this Reflection. I'm not sure we're going to get to the reflection in this tutorial, but we are going to make it, just so we have it on hand there. And this is going to be shadeless as well. Again, I like to set everything all the way up to the top there. We're going to go into the texture slot. We're going to hit New. We're going to call this texture Reflection. And we're going to load an environment map. This is where we're going to use those maps that we created before. So let's jump in here to the image file, and we'll open up our construction site map, and it'll be this one here, which is the box map, and that is our reflection material. We also need to set the mapping to reflection. Okay, so that's all set, and this material we can call upon for a whole bunch of other materials later on. This is one material where we can load our textures into, and then it will affect all of the materials that we create for our scene. That's the idea. Let's make another material. We're going to hit New. We'll call this diffuse. And this is also going to be shadeless. I'm going to bump everything up to the top again, because that's how I roll. And we'll go to the texture slot. We'll add a new texture. We're going to call the texture diffuse. It's good to label things and be organized. I'm only organized because I'm making a tutorial, otherwise I wouldn't be. And this one is also going to be an environment map. We're going to come down here to the image file slot, and we're going to open the diffuse texture that we made from our previous tutorial. And again, we need to map that as a reflection. Okay, so we've made a diffuse material, we've made a reflection material, we've made a composite material where we're going to kind of gather everything together. And we need to make one more material. We're going to call this one light mask. Actually, so it's a little bit clear, we'll call it shadow mask. Okay, so we'll put that in there, and spell that right. Shadow mask. What this needs to be is it needs to be a white material with no specularity. And I just kind of like to leave everything the way it is. The hardness is at about 50, and I just use the Lambert shading. this is okay. I mean, you can kind of play around with this. It will change the way that the shadows are cast. In general, the way the materials are going to look is going to be dictated by the way that we are mixing and compositing our reflection, diffuse, and other kinds of materials and textures. That the lighting isn't really going to affect the way the materials look. It's going to be the textures that affect the way it looks, because we're using those colors to influence the specularity and all that other sort of stuff. So we don't need any specularity on this. We don't want to have any. We're just making a material that's going to be a mask, so that wherever light is shining and illuminating white, that becomes a mask that tells our node setup where to apply certain materials. Okay, so shadow mask is just a shaded material that's all white, completely white, and just the default settings is perfectly fine. Okay, so we have the three things that we're going to need. We really only need two of these for what we're going to do today. Let's open up a node editor. So we'll slide up here and we'll go to the node editor, and we'll go to the composite slot, and we're going to click on this button to use shader nodes, and you see everything will disappear. We're not going to need that composite material. This is just the material that we're using to composite everything together. So we're going to load something else instead. We're going to load the shadow mask first, so we can look at that. So down here we'll select shadow mask. You can see what that looks like, and it's showing our light shining on our Suzanne there. Let's go up to the light and we'll get a few settings set here. We're going to turn on the sun lamp, and it's set to 1. We'll leave it at 1. I'm also going to jump over to the game engine real quick, because it gives us a few more features here for our lighting. We're going to set the buffer type to variance. It's going to make it a little bit softer, and we'll turn up our clip to about 40 just to give us a little bit more room there, and that should do it. That's all we really need. Let's go back to the internal render engine, and what we're going to do is we're going to load in our environment map here. So we'll go to the world, and we'll go to the texture slot for the world. We'll open up an image or movie. Again, this is for an equirectangular image. We'll go to our folder, and we're going to grab our equirectangular construction site image, load that in. We want to set this to horizon, turn off blend, and then we are going to go to the world settings. We're going to click on real sky, and I think I forgot one thing. Let's go back to the texture. We need to set the mapping coordinates to equirectangular, otherwise it won't work. So now if we go to our display settings here and we click world background, we can see our world background. This is very, very cool that we can do this in the Viewport in Blender Internal. What we want to do is we want to set our sun so that it's shining from the main light source, because this is the light source that's going to be casting shadows. None of the other light influence will really be casting shadows. They're just going to be giving soft light. So that soft light's going to be taken care of by our diffuse texture, but we do need to be able to generate a shadow if we want this to be authentic. So we'll take our light, we'll just kind of move it out here so we can get approximation of our line of sight here. And we'll turn on the rotation controls, and we'll kind of rotate it so it's facing the right direction, and we'll tilt it up just a little bit. We're using the world controls here, and we're probably pretty close right there. Maybe go up a little bit more. I think this is about right. So let's just take this and we'll move it back a little bit. And you can see our monkey head is illuminated now, showing our white texture, but you can see very stark shadow in the back, and then this very light white. So right now it's not using any world environment, it's just using an OpenGL light. We want to be able to apply our world lighting to this, and then just use this as a matte to generate the shadows. So let's go back to our node setup here, and we're going to add another material. So I'll input an additional material. This material is going to be the diffuse material, and if I load that in right now, you'll see how that's applied. It looks like a kind of a brushed metallic look to it, so it's got the world lighting applied to the object. And this is going to be used to influence our color so that it appears to have ambient light from the scene, that blue from the sky, and kind of the tan from the ground around it. So let's get to this here. We're going to use our diffuse texture in a few different ways. First, we're going to use it as a mask to tell the object where the shadows should be. So the darker colors from the diffuse texture are where shadowy kinds of portions should be at. These are places where there is no light source reflecting from that environment map that we created, or at least there's less of it. So let's try to do that here. We're going to add in a color mix node. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our output here and apply it to the factor. And then we're going to put the color, we'll put the color of our object into here. Let me see if I can add just an input for a color. So let's say we want our monkey head to be, oh, I don't know, kind of a clay color. So we'll move this down towards the oranges a little bit, turn it up so it looks a little bit like a, turn this down a little bit. Actually, I don't know why I'm doing that. I can probably just grab a color inside the scene there. Maybe like this color back here. Yeah, that's good. It's kind of a gray color. So this is going to be the color of our object. Now if I just drop this into the material, you'll see that there's no influence on it at all. Okay, I'm going to drop this into the bottom slot here, and then in the top slot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply another instance of the same color that's considerably darker. So let's add in a color RGB curve. We'll put this on here. And on this RGB curve, I'm going to take the lights and drop them way down. So this is what the color looks like. It's considerably darker. It's not black. It's still in the same color. It's being influenced by that one color. Okay, and then what I'm doing is I'm using my diffuse texture to mask where the dark color is applied and then where the light version of it is applied. And that's kind of our starting base for the general lighting. So the diffuse texture is telling the material where the light sources are coming from inside of the scene based on that box map. Follow? Okay. From here, I'm going to now add another mix node so we can add on top of this our color influence from our diffuse. So we'll take the output from this and put it in the top. Then we're going to take the diffuse texture and put it in the bottom. And we're going to set this to an add blend mode. And we'll drop this output in there. Now you can see that it's adding in the color from the scene. So I've got my blue tones and tan tones. Now this is pretty heavy. There's an awful lot of influence going on there. So I'm going to turn this down quite a bit. I'm going to turn it down to 0.25, maybe we'll call that. Again, this is a lot of trial and error to sort out how this is going to work. Okay, so you can start to see this color influence here. So the original color is this, and then the output from the world lighting is that. So the idea is that if I were to apply my light source to this, the brightest color, the brightest portion, most directly lit, should look about like that. So that's what we're going to shoot for. Okay. Let's see if we can apply our shadow mask now. We'll add another mix node. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our shadow mask as the factor. and we're going to apply to this a couple instances of what we're looking at right here. We're going to generate one that looks a little bit darker for shadows specifically, and we'll probably make one that looks a little bit lighter to try to get back to the tones of our original image there. So let's add in another RGB curve. First, let's see if we can get our colors back up to a little bit closer to where they were from the original color input. So that's there, and the lightest part should match pretty close. So we do have a little bit of color influence on it, which is what we want in the scene, but it should match pretty close there. Okay, and then we'll do another one of these color RGB curves, and we'll put the output into that. And this one should look like a pretty dark shadow. So we'll turn this way down and get a darker color there. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the light one and we're going to put it on the bottom. We're going to take the dark one, we're going to put it on the top. And then when we mix this together, we get shadow. So this is authentic shadow, but all of the portions of this are dictated by the influence of our box diffuse map, and that's the goal. This is, this has overtones of blue from the sky and the tans from the ground, and it's also influencing where the light sources are coming from in the scene, so that no matter where you're looking at it, you're getting the color from the environment and you're getting the influence of the light sources from the environment, even though we're also casting a light that's generating our shadow. Okay, now this is artistic license here. You have to kind of figure out, what is the right balance. Is this too dark or not? Now if I look inside my scene, I'm noticing that the shadow back here looks pretty close to what I'm getting here. It's not far off, and this color is not far off on the lit part from what my color is here, so it's actually pretty close. Now I might play around with these a little bit and try to get my colors a little bit closer to where I want them to be. Maybe I want to increase my the influence of my environment map here, my diffuse color, so I might go back to my add node here where I'm adding in my diffuse texture and jump that up to maybe 0.3 and see how that, I can go up to 0.5 and really see how it influences it. And you can see I get a lot of color in there. It starts to look metallic at this point, gets kind of a sheen to it, so maybe we'll turn that back down to 0.3 for right now. Okay, and that's pretty much the essence of what we're doing here. Now if we want to see how this would be applied to additional materials, here's what we'll do. We're going to come back here and we're going to select all of the nodes that are part of this effect. So I'm going to hit B for box selection. I'm going to select everything in between the output and the color input. And then I'm going to go to the node and I'm going to click on Make Group. And then over here I only want to have one color input because the color I have coming in, the material coming in, is going to come from the same place. By default it makes two because I had two outputs. It was going to two different branches there. So I'm just going to take this here and drop it up here on the top one. And we'll go to this group input, and under the node we can hit collapse and hide unused. And now I've got everything right. If I tab out of this now, and I can remove that one, I won't need it. And on the same node group I can again do the same thing, go to node and go to collapse and hide unused sockets, and now I only have the one socket coming in. I'm going to name this. I'm going to call this shadow mask. Now this is doing a lot more than applying a shadow mask. It's also applying my diffuse texture. Okay, but now I'm in a situation where I can generate a material and I can just slide it into this one group. I can add this group from any any place I want to in any material. So if I go to add and I go up to group, I now have shadow mask in my group menu, and I've made that. So I want to save this so I can always come back to it. Now to see how this would work with other objects, I can just duplicate my Suzanne, and we'll slide her back so she's having a shadow cast on her. And we'll turn on the ambient occlusion so we can look at those effects, and set the distance to 1, pump this up to 3, set my samples up 120 or so. And you can see this is pretty good. I've got a shadow being cast, and I've got also world environment lighting influence there. So I didn't really have to do much. I just needed to get one light in there to give me my shadow source, and that was it. So this is pretty good to go. I mean, these things look pretty good. They look like they're really in the location. I can show you very quickly what this looks like then to change environments. So if I want to, and actually before I do that, let me see if we can make another material here. Let's click on our first Suzanne. We'll go to the node setup here, and I'm going to click on the composite output. I'm going to click on that too, and we're going to call this, let's call it, I don't know, blue. And if we go back to the node setup, we'll change this to a blue color. You can see how that is then influenced by the lighting around it. And I just want to point out that the light is white. It's just a mask though. See that these purples are coming from the influence of the diffuse texture, which would be giving off oranges. You see that? And reds. And those oranges and reddy colors get applied to this and give you the purple hue that you would see with this object actually being in the scene. Let's come over to the other Suzanne, and this one is its own texture, so we'll call it green. And we'll come over here and we'll select kind of a green color. So you see how that works. And maybe we'll rotate Suzanne here. Pretty cool. Let's see if we can apply this to a different scenario. So let's go to our world texture, and we'll load in a different one. So we'll go to the atrium, and we'll load in this equirectangular environment. Now it's still using the light source and the diffuse texture from my construction site for the object, so we have to change those items there. Let's quickly move our light into place where it needs to be. So right now the light is almost actually right where it needs to be. We're going to jump it up here and spin it a little bit. And you'll notice that the lighting in this scene is not quite as intense, just in general. So for my light influence, we're gonna want a lot of a softer light, more of a shadow in there. For my light influence on the lamp, I'm gonna knock the energy down to 0.6. Let's do that. And then I'm gonna duplicate my light and rotate it on the x-axis 180 degrees. Whoops. Try that again. Rotate on the z-axis 180 degrees. And we'll just slide it for context's sake over here. So I've got a light coming from this side and a light coming from this side. And let's select just one of these Suzannes. We'll go to the material slot, and under the diffuse texture, we don't need to change the reflection one because we're not using it, but under diffuse, we can change out our texture to the atrium diffuse. And now automatically it will be updated. And you can see that it looks pretty good. I'm getting the tones from this environment, the light tones from this environment influencing the masking of the light source, and also the additive lighting to these materials here. You can see that it's a very red room. It's a blue monkey head, so I'm getting purple. That's the way it ought to be. So it's pretty cool, pretty good. Just to prove another concept real quick here, we're going to have a tutorial that's going to be devoted to the reflection material, and there's a few things that we want to add to our reflection. We're going to need to add a Fresnel effect. We're actually going to look into generating a transparent crystalline kind of material too that will give us refraction. We'll have to generate a Fresnel effect with that too, but just for the sake of demonstrating the simple idea here, let me select the Suzanne. We'll go back to our node group, and I'm going to add another material. And this material is going to be the reflection material, but I need to go back to my reflection, and I need to load in the reflection for the atrium. So we'll go back to the atrium folder, and we'll get the box map, and come back to the material slot for this node group. And instead of the color, I'm going to bring in the reflection material. So you can see that this reflective material is being influenced. Now, if I wanted just a pure mirror, I could just throw that right in there and it would be relatively close. It's giving me the right lighting. But if I want this to be influenced, if it's not a pure mirror, you can see that it would be influenced by these other textures, and you can see that this looks like an object that's actually in that environment now. It's pretty fancy. So that's how this node group can work for you. You see in this environment there's a lot more shadow, and that's the way the texture is. It's a darker texture. The light's all coming from the top. So this automatically has adjusted to our environment. And again, if I go to my camera, I can set my output to full HD 100%, and if I hit my render button, see it renders in a second, less than a second. I've got a full HD version of that. So there you go. This is how you generate a node group for shadow masking using some of these textures. This is my methodology anyway for it. We're going to move on from here in the next little installments of this series, and we'll look at reflection, refraction, bump mapping, and other various techniques. And hopefully by the end of the series we'll have a bunch of node groups that you can have saved aside in a file that you can load in and generate materials very quickly on the fly using those node groups. So anyway, good luck with this, and I wish all of you happy blending.